The movie opens with Brian Godlock running frantically through the streets. Hearing gunshots in the distance, he rushes toward the sound. He soon spots two cars from rival gangs engaged in a violent shootout. One gangster shoots the driver of the other car, causing it to crash. As the gangsters head in his direction, Brian looks around and grabs a metal pipe. He blocks one of the cars and smashes its windshield as it comes toward him, nearly causing a crash. Moments later, the gangsters aim their guns at him. He forced Brian to run for his life. While fleeing, Brian saw a forklift and, acting on instinct, used it to jump over the gangster's truck, decapitating one man. One of the survivors then shot Brian in the back. Moments later, a man covered in rough tattoos walked up and shot Brian in the throat, leaving him to die. Brian was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, barely holding on to life. His wife, Sae, stayed by his side, praying for him to survive. The doctors saved him, and over time, he began to recover. Not long after, Detective Vassal, who had been searching for him, came to visit. A few days later, Brian woke up and Saya rushed to his side with tears of joy. He began therapy to learn to walk again, but the attack had taken his voice. The loss crushed him. One day, he stood before a mirror, eyes filled with tears, silently screaming at his own reflection. Saya gave him a voice box to help him speak, but his frustration grew, and he turned it off. After some time, he was discharged from the hospital. The next part of his story was about to unfold. Saya drove Brian home through a city scarred by gang violence, destruction, and decay. Everything around them looked broken and dangerous. Eventually, they reached Silence, the town where the tragedy had happened. As they pulled up to the house, Brian thought of better days when his son Taylor was still alive and pictured them playing together in the front yard. Tears filled his eyes as he looked at the empty yard. Inside, Taylor's toys still sat on the table, and the Christmas tree remained standing with unopened gifts beneath it. Overcome with grief, Brian broke down, unable to bear the loss of his son. Saya held him tightly as he wept. Nearby, he noticed a news article about Taylor's murder by gang members. In a surge of anger, he tore it to pieces. Brian went into the kitchen and grabbed a bottle of vodka. He asked Saya for help, but she broke down in tears, unsure of what to do. The next morning, as Saya got ready for work, she noticed Brian hadn't slept in their bed. She found him in another room, drinking alone. Not knowing how to approach him, she sent him a text asking if he had seen her keys, but he didn't reply. Brian's mind was still filled with memories of Taylor. He walked into his son's untouched room and sat on the bed, tears streaming down his face. Slowly, he lay down, as if trying to feel his son's presence beside him once more. Later, he sat in the front yard, remembering the day of the tragedy. They had been outside while Taylor was learning to ride his new bike. Suddenly, two gangsters drove by and opened fire. In the chaos, Brian and Saya realized Taylor had been shot. He died in their arms. Unable to sit and do nothing, Brian rushed to his workshop. He pushed aside the vodka bottles and grabbed his tools. Later, Saya came home and sat in her car for a moment before going inside. Not seeing Brian, she sent him a text. Then she spotted him and realized he was ignoring her message. Brian found Detective Vassal's business card and went to the station to see him. While waiting in Vassal's office, he noticed photos of local gang members on the wall and quietly took pictures of them. As he looked through the images, he recognized the man who had shot him, a gangster named Pla. Before Vassal returned, Brian had already left. At home, he pinned the gang members' photos to his wall, ready to investigate them himself. He circled December 24th on a calendar, the day he planned to kill them all. Brian started working out and watching videos on knife fighting. As his training went on, the distance between him and Saya grew, but he kept his focus on one thing: revenge. A few months later, Brian bought a used car, feeling one step closer to his goal. Meanwhile, Saya struggled to keep up with the bills. At night, she heard him in the garage, modifying the car, and it began to wear her down. Brian also trained with guns. At first, his aim was terrible, but he kept practicing until he improved. Over time, he built up a stash of weapons and started listening to police radio for information. One night, Brian stepped away from his training to spend time with Saya. She missed him, but by then she had decided to move in with her mother and leave him. Frustrated, Brian took out his anger on his training dummy before going for a drive to practice his skills. By October, he was tracking the gangsters' hideouts and secretly photographing their activities. One day, he saw Pla losing his temper and spotted another man leaving in a car. He quickly snapped a photo of the license plate. By then, Brian had transformed into a powerhouse, muscular, strong, and a skilled driver who could control his car with precision. At the shooting range, Brian could now hit his targets fast and with precision. The gangsters no longer stood a chance against him. One day, he saw a boy who looked just like Taylor. Overcome with emotion, he hugged the child, but it wasn't his son. As he walked back to his car, he spotted a gangster handing out money to kids nearby. Brian reached for his knife but stopped, knowing there were too many children around. Later, Brian accidentally bumped into another gangster who shoved him to the ground. The gangster's girlfriend then dumped ice cream on him, adding to his humiliation. That night, Brian steeled himself for what lay ahead. On December 23 AD, tracked down a gangster's home and broke in. The man heard a noise and went to check, but Brian knocked him out. He later woke up, tied to the roof of Brian's garage. Brian entered wearing a welding mask, slashed him, and gave him a pen and paper demanding information about the gang. Brian sat down, but the gangster suddenly attacked and tried to escape. He grabbed Brian's knife and stabbed him in the leg. They fought fiercely. In the end, Brian stabbed him with a screwdriver and tackled him to the ground. The gangster fought back hard, but Brian eventually overpowered him and won. On the 24th, Brian prepared for what lay ahead. He packed his gear, put on body armor, and loaded his guns. Before leaving, he wrote a note and took one last look at Taylor's room, memorizing every detail, knowing he might never return. On the way out, he passed the place where Saya was staying and saw her painting a picture of Taylor, using art to cope with her pain. Brian then visited Taylor's grave on his son's birthday. He brought a gift and sat there alone, crying for the first time in a long while. After some time, he opened the gift for Taylor himself. That night, Detective Vassell heard a noise and went to investigate with his gun. When he opened the door, he found a gangster tied up and gagged, with a note beside him. The police soon arrived and arrested the gangster. Detective Vassell opened the note and read Brian's message, saying he was taking care of what should have been done long ago. With the note was a flash drive containing detailed information about the gang and all the evidence Brian had gathered over the past year. Meanwhile, Brian was driving when he heard a police report about gang activity on the radio. Passing by, he saw two gangsters beating and robbing a couple. When one tried to run, Brian pinned him against a wall with his car, then rammed the other before speeding off with the remaining one still in his sights. While in his car, Brian struggled with a gangster, trying to push him out. When the man pulled a gun, Brian disarmed him and shot him dead. The shock of taking his first life made Brian vomit. Later, he went to the gang's hideout and threw a wrapped package over the wall. A gang member took it to his boss. Inside was the severed finger of the man Brian had just killed. Elsewhere in the city, a major gang shootout erupted. Many police officers were shot and forced to take cover. Brian arrived and saw a female officer who had been hit. He drove straight into the chaos, firing at the gang members and killing as many as he could. Nearby, someone was live streaming the entire event, capturing the moment the gangsters opened fire on Brian's car. Brian fought to fend off the gangster and save the injured police officer, but she was shot while trying to get into the car and died beside him. He gently pushed her body out of the car. Then he spotted the man who had been live streaming the event and rammed him with his car, sending him flying. Brian picked up the live streamer's phone, saw the video still running, and shot him dead so Play would witness it. Somehow, Pla realized Brian was behind the attack. He quickly sent a message to his gang, ordering them to hunt Brian down. Meanwhile, some gang members were fighting rivals when they saw a car approaching. It was Brian staring straight at them. Before driving off again, Brian stopped on a bridge and took out an old musical toy that had belonged to Taylor. He listened to its tune, reminding himself why he was doing all this. Then he hit the road again. Soon, the gangsters caught up and began chasing him through the city. Brian made a sharp 180-degree turn to face the gangsters head-on. He took a risky shot and killed one of the men in their vehicle. He drove off, but the remaining gangsters kept chasing him. A man on a motorcycle soon joined the pursuit, shooting at Brian and forcing him to speed up. Brian then ran into a roadblock, trapped between two trucks filled with gangsters firing at him. He killed one of them, then executed a pit maneuver on the front truck, causing both vehicles to crash into each other in a chaotic wreck. The biker continued chasing Brian, shooting at his now damaged car. He pulled up next to Brian's window, but Brian grabbed his gun, causing the biker to lose control and crash into a wall. Brian finally stopped to catch his breath. Meanwhile, Detective Vassal sat in his car, reviewing the evidence Brian had provided. Brian drove toward the gang's headquarters, where the gangsters were meeting to discuss the recent attack on their men. He sneaked into the hideout by following a convoy of gang vehicles. When a gunfight erupted, Brian detonated his motorcycle, creating a massive explosion that set several gang members on fire. While Brian was taking down the gang members, Pla was upstairs enjoying himself with the villainess. Brian reached the building and heard the men screaming inside. He paused for a moment to catch his breath. Armed thugs began coming down the stairs, and Brian opened fire as they appeared. He fought fiercely, and his training was evident. None of the men stood a chance against his relentless attack. Switching to his sidearm, Brian continued taking down enemies one by one. At one point, he tried to reload his shotgun, but was hit 3 times in the chest. Luckily, his body armor absorbed the shots, and he quickly got back up. He then planted an explosive trap in the main hallway. Suddenly, Brian was attacked by a gangster named Ruiz. Ruiz was much stronger and easily overpowered him, throwing him around and taking his weapon. As Brian struggled to reach for his gun, he took several hard punches. Then, a group of gangsters accidentally triggered the bomb trap, distracting Ruiz. Brian seized the chance to stab him in the shoulder, but Ruiz didn't go down. Instead, he slammed Brian with a brutal suplex. Meanwhile, Detective Vassal entered the building, walking past the dead bodies. Exhausted, both Brian and Ruiz reached for their guns. Ruiz fired first, but Brian disarmed him and shot him in the head. Vassal was attacked, but skillfully took down all the men charging at him. He found Brian, and for a moment, the two aimed their guns at each other in silence. Then Vassal lowered his weapon, showing he was on Brian's side. Suddenly, Pia opened fire on both of them. She ran for cover, reloaded, and shot Brian, then hit Vassal in the arm. Amid the chaos, Brian crawled toward her and aimed his gun at her head, forcing her to drop her weapon, but he couldn't bring himself to shoot. Pia then pulled out a pistol and shot Brian twice before turning the gun on Vassal. Seeing what happened, Brian shot and killed her. Both he and Vassal were injured and struggling to recover. Later, Brian grabbed his handgun and went after Play. The two faced off and exchanged gunfire. Brian took several hits to his bulletproof vest and began to weaken. Just as Pla was about to deliver the final blow, Vassal shot him from behind. This gave Brian the chance to tackle Play to the ground, punch him repeatedly, and strangle him to death, even as Play continued to resist until the very end. Then, Brian stared into Pla's eyes, and in his final moments, He imagined a happy Taylor smiling at him. Vassal crawled over to Brian, who was now seeing Taylor's short life flash before his eyes, even imagining the future she could have had. In the next scene, Saya stands by Taylor's grave. Brian's toy is revealed to be a toy train circling the headstone. She reads a note from him and leaves it by the grave.